anew by singing Alice's Restaurant and aired on PBS stations across the country. Now, I don't remember if it was the Grand Dragon or the Exalted Cyclops, because I often confuse them. But he said it was his proudest act. And I think that's because he understood how dangerous Pacifica is, how dangerous independent media is. Dangerous because it allows people to speak for themselves. And when you hear someone speaking from their own experience, whether it's a Palestinian child or an Israeli grandmother, whether it's a child coming over the border from Mexico into Arizona, or a kid from the South Bronx, that starts to challenge stereotypes and caricatures that fuel the hate groups. There is nothing more powerful than hearing someone speak for themselves. I'm not saying you'll agree with them. I mean, how often do we even agree with our family members? But you begin to understand where they're coming from. You begin to find some kind of common ground. And I think that's the beginning of peace. The media can be the greatest force for peace on earth. Instead, it is wielded as a weapon of war. And that's why we have to take the media back. 10 years ago, in the lead up to the Iraq War, I mean, this is a perfect illustration of how the media works. The group FAIR, that's Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting, it's a media watch group, FAIR.org, based in New York, did a study of the 4 major nightly newscasts, 2 weeks around Colin Powell, when he was Secretary of State, giving his push for war at the United Nations, February 5th, 2003. Now, this was about 6 weeks before the U.S. invaded Iraq. The country was evenly divided, people for and against the war. They looked at the 4 major nightly newscasts, NBC Nightly News, ABC World News Tonight, CBS Evening News, and the PBS NewsHour. In that 2-week period, there were 393 interviews done around war. So half the population for and half of against, so maybe there would be 200, 175, interviews for and against. Not exactly. There were 393 interviews done around war. Guess how many were with anti-war leaders? 3. 3 of almost 400. That is no longer a mainstream media. That's an extreme media beating the drums for war. I really do think that those who are concerned about war and peace, those who are concerned about the growing inequality in this country, the economic disparity, those who are concerned about climate change, about the fate of the planet, are not a fringe minority, not even a silent majority, but the silenced majority, silenced by the corporate media, which is why we have to take it back. The private corporations own the media. A handful of corporations own most of those channels that you see on cable, on broadcast. But they don't actually own the airwaves. They lease them. The airwaves are a national treasure. They're absolutely essential. I encourage everyone I can to go into the media, to become a journalist, to be active at least, become a media activist. It is so important because it is the way we learn about the rest of the world. If we don't know someone from another country, we learn about another country through the media. And the rest of the world learns about us in the same way. And it has to be through something other than a corporate lens. Yes, I think it is a matter of national security when the rest of the world learns about us through the lens of a private corporation. It really does matter. And we have to be deeply concerned about freedom of the press. In 2008, I had the experience, along with some of my colleagues, covering the Democratic Convention in Denver, where there was mass protest. This was 2008. The war was still raging in Iraq and continues to in Afghanistan. And at the Democratic Convention, the one where President Obama was nominated, there were thousands of people marched against war. At the Republican Convention, we flew from Denver to St. Paul, Minneapolis. Same thing. So I want to talk about the Republican Convention of that year. It was the first day of the convention, Labor Day 2008. And there was a major protest called for the morning, led by soldiers, some of them in full military regalia, which is at great risk to themselves to do this. And then, of course, thousands of civilians following. And they marched from St. Paul City Hall to the convention center where the Republican convention would begin later that day. And they marched against war. Big, peaceful protest, beautiful blue sky day. You know, we were covering the protests and interviewing people, and then I went off to the convention floor to begin the interviews with the delegates, and my colleagues, Nicole Salazar and Sharif Abdokadus, went back to the studios to begin to digitize the tape for the next morning's broadcast. So I was on the floor of the convention with Rick Rowley, who is working with us as a cameraman. His film, along with Jeremy Skaha, was just nominated for an Oscar, Dirty Wars, which I'll talk about in a bit. So Rick and I were on the floor, and I was interviewing delegates from the hottest state at the time, Alaska. Sarah Palin had just been nominated, was about to be nominated. And I got a call. Come quickly to 7th and Jackson. This is in St. Paul. I didn't even know where 7th and Jackson was. They said Nicole and Sharif have been beaten by the police and they've been arrested. I said, what, is this some kind of joke? I was just with them. They're in the studio digitizing tape. And Mike Burke, our senior producer, said, no, come now. So we raced off the floor of the convention. And it's hard to even get to the floor. You have to go through all sort of security cordons. And we got the top security clearances to interview presidents and vice presidents. And, you know, we're wearing all those credentials. We raced down the street. We make our way to 7th and Jackson. I see that there's a complete police cordon around this big old parking lot. And I see a lot of people inside. But the police have the area totally under control. And I understand that somewhere in there, Nicole and Sharif are. So, I mean, I deal with this in New York as well. I have to find a commanding officer to have our reporters released. So I go running down the line of police. They've cordoned off the area. And I stop at one of the officers and I say, excuse me, I want to speak to your commanding officer. 2 of our reporters inside. We need to have them released. It wasn't seconds before he ripped me through the police line, twisted my arms back, other police joining him, handcuffed me. I was begging them, don't arrest me. I just want to speak to your commanding officer. Threw me up against the wall onto the ground and charged me with a misdemeanor, interfering with a peace officer. If only there was a peace officer in the vicinity. And so I'm laying on the ground, and I'm desperately looking for Sharif and Nicole. And I see Sharif across the parking lot, his hands behind his back. I can't find Nicole. And I demand to be brought to him. Finally, they bring me over to him. His arm is bleeding. And we're both standing there, and we are demanding to be released. We keep saying, you know we're journalists. You have to release us now. Then the Secret Service came over, and they ripped the credentials from around our necks. I was then brought into a police van, and there was Nicole. Her face was bloody. She was handcuffed. She had her credentials on. And I said, Nicole, what happened? And very quickly, as we're being taken to jail, she said, we were in the TV studio. We heard a commotion downstairs. I grabbed the camera. Sharif grabbed the microphone. They wouldn't have been doing their jobs if they'd stayed in the studio. They ran downstairs. They saw riot police, and they saw protesters, and Nicole started to film. She was in this parking lot, so she was against parked cars, and the riot police are coming at her, and they were shouting, on your face, move, move. And she's saying, where? Because she's against the parked cars, and they say, on your face. She's filming. She did not plan to film her own violent arrest. But the riot police come at her, and she did not know what hit her, because they came at her from behind and in front, and they slammed her to the ground on her face. The first thing that happened is her camera tumbled down, and they immediately took the battery out of her camera. If you were wondering what it was, they wanted to stop happening. Sharif is a very calm guy. You know, he went on to cover the Egyptian revolution. He is Egyptian American. He flew home that week of January 25th, that remarkable week, 2011, when the uprising began in Egypt, and has remained there all of this time, covering it for Democracy Now! Now, he hasn't been arrested under Mubarak or under Morsi or under the new military regime, but in the streets of St. Paul, in a celebration of democracy, a political convention, he gets arrested. Nicole is down on the ground, her face is bloody. The police have their knee or boot in her back. And the reason her face was bloody is they started to drag her on the ground, and she couldn't protect her face. Sharif is trying to stop this from happening. And he tells the rioting police to calm down. And they take him and they throw him up against the wall, they kick him twice in the chest, and they take him down, bloodying his arm. So there we are, we were arrested. They were charged with, they were facing felony charges, Sharif and Nicole. So Nicole and I, the women, are taken in this police van. They drop me off at the police garage where they've erected cages to put the protesters in. And Nicole is taken to jail, as is Sharif. So we didn't know what was happening as we were detained, but over those hours, so many people learned about our detention. They got thousands of calls, emails, faxes, the local authorities to free us. And in a number of hours, I was freed, and then Sharif and Nicole were freed. So I was then taken back to the convention center. The convention was over for the evening. And I was brought into the NBC skybox to be interviewed. And they were asking, you know, what happened? So I did the interview, and when they closed the camera, an NBC reporter comes over. He says, I don't get it. He said, why wasn't I arrested? And so I said, oh, were you outside covering the protest? He said, no. So I said, well, I don't get arrested in the skybox either. You know, I mean, we have a job to do. We do have to be in the convention, on the convention floor, interviewing the delegates, finding out, you know, what are the debates within the party, what are the issues, the concerns of each state. We got to get into the corporate suites, find out who is sponsoring the Republican Governors Association or the Democratic Senatorial Campaign Committee. I can't tell you how many doors I walked in reaching for the chocolate strawberries and saying, oh, who provided these? And getting thrown out. But still, trying my best to find out. I mean, that's our job, is to follow the money. And then it's also our job to get outside, where the protests are, where thousands of people are. They are the uninvited guests, and they have something important to say as well. You know, democracy is a messy thing, but it's our job to capture it all. And we shouldn't have to get a record when we try to put things on the record. So we were able to cover the convention that week. We left the convention and we sued the St. Paul, Minneapolis police and the Secret Service. We felt it was absolutely critical. I mean, it's very difficult to do this kind of thing. Not to mention we have a daily news show and we're moving forward from the convention. And yet, if they continue to arrest and beat journalists, if we don't stand up, it's not just a threat to journalists. It's a threat to your freedom to know, to your access to information. And we must all protect this. So that lawsuit went on for a few years. We were finally brought in by the judge in St. Paul to settle the lawsuit. The Secret Service was furious. They wanted to be severed from the lawsuit. They don't get sued for these things. You see, it's very difficult to figure out who is part of this military police security cordon.
Very tough to figure out who we were confronting. Many people have numbers covered, names covered. They've got all different levels of uniform. You know, they've got these fusion centers, every level of government. But the reason we knew it was the Secret Service that ripped the credentials from around our necks is when we were standing there and the police officer who had brought me over when I demanded to see Sharif, and by then my hands, I couldn't even feel them, and I asked him, could you just loosen the handcuffs? And I was afraid to ask that because I suspected I knew what would happen. He tightened them. But we were standing there, we were in a lot of pain, and when they ripped the credentials from around our neck, I turned to him, I said, this is just unacceptable that you would do this. You know we're journalists, and you rip the credentials from around our necks to try to hide this fact? He said, we didn't do that. That was the Secret Service. And so we had it from the police that that was the Secret Service. And so the depositions and the Secret Service knew that we knew. So we got a landmark settlement, a six-figure settlement, going back and forth with the police and the Secret Service, and a requirement that the St. Paul police would be trained in dealing with journalists. And we came back to New York, and we didn't want this to be secret. This was the point where we were coming into the next convention that would be taking place in 2012. And we wanted to send a very strong message to the police there. And we thought, where can we send this message, get the word out? Well, we went home to New York, and where was the largest gathering of police that we could find? And it was at Zuccotti Park, Occupy Wall Street. So we held our news conference announcing the settlement in the middle of Occupy Wall Street, which was fascinating in itself. Yes, you had hundreds of police officers there through that period. But you had this movement, and I know many of you here at the university are studying grassroots movements. So when you look at what happened in 2011, it really is astounding, that year of mass movements and uprisings. You know, I remember flying into Madison, Wisconsin, 150,000 people marched. By the way, that's Dennis Moynihan, our Special Projects Coordinator, and he's handing out our daily digest sign-up list for you to sign up with, and he's co-author of two of our books, The Silenced Majority and also Breaking the Sound Barrier. We write a column together every week that's distributed by King Features, and any newspaper can take it. But this is our way of keeping in touch with you and sending you our headlines every day and media alerts, so I do hope you sign up. You can also just sign up at democracynow.org. But I couldn't do this work without the remarkable group of people, the brain trust who are Democracy Now! And you, by the way, are all an extension of this, and we hope for your recommendations on stories, writing to us, suggesting people, issues to cover. This is how this program has grown from 8 community radio stations in 1996 to over 1,200 public radio and television stations today. We just went on with 2 big PBS stations in Los Angeles, as well as the 2 big PBS stations in San Francisco. We hope we could be broadcast by Arizona PBS. Remember, the P stands for the public, for the people. So it's up to you to ask. That's how we end up on stations all over the country. But covering these movements in Wisconsin, the largest protest Wisconsin had ever seen, 150,000 people in I don't know how many degrees below zero the weather was, but it was astounding. And I went up on one of these cranes to look, just get that bird's eye view. And there was the Labor Museum across the street. And I mean, just to understand, if you ever have any thought that these uprisings don't matter or aren't that significant, that in the olden times, the Civil Rights Movement, the Abolition Movement, these were significant movements, but these ones maybe now get crushed. You have to think again. I mean, there we were covering this protest, and you think about where Dr. King died. Right? Dr. Martin Luther King died in Memphis, Tennessee. Why was he there? April 4th, 1968. He was marching with local sanitation workers who were simply organizing Local 1707 of AFSCME, the American Federation of State, County, Municipal Employees. Where was AFSCME born? In Wisconsin in 1932, right around the time that the John Birch Society was also born. which was, co-founded by Fred Koch, the father of the Koch brothers. And very interesting. Wisconsin is a very interesting hotbed of all kinds of political activity. But to see people across the political spectrum, I mean, this